It's been 10 years since Hideo Kojima's landmark masterpieces, MGS5 Ground Zeroes, and of course, PT, the playable teaser for the since-cancelled Kojima reboot of beloved psychological horror series Silent Hill. In this video, I'll be making the case for something I've yet to see anyone else point out, that as well as a playable teaser for Silent Hills, PT arguably also represents a teaser for the events and themes of Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain, which as of 2014 was not yet released. By the end of this video, I will go so far as to suggest the possibility that in PT, we are actually MGS5's protagonist, Punished Venom Snake, undergoing the so-called hypnagogic therapy that will provide the dissociative identity disorder necessary to implant a second identity, namely Big Boss, within him. This undergirds, of course, the entire plot of the coming game. It may even be that all that forgetfulness in Metal Gear 87 is some kind of dissociative amnesia that Venom Snake suffers for the rest of his life, thanks to the things we sort of experience through him in PT. Let's dig in.
This is your family.
Oh my God! Show's over. Get out of here.
PT opens inside a solitary confinement cell, and right away we're being asked by the game, using the power of suggestion and interactivity, to assume someone else's identity. The marks on the wall here, like so much else in PT, actually belong to someone else. These photos are of a different man's family. In fact, he isn't an individual, a single man at all, more like the concept of the all-American white male made flesh.
Dad was such a drag. Every day he'd eat the same kind of food, dress the same, sit in front of the same kind of games. Yeah, he was just that kind of guy. But then one day he goes and kills us all. He couldn't even be original about the way he did it. I'm not complaining. I was dying of boredom anyway.
The same goes for Lisa, the ghost of his murdered wife, and their murdered unborn baby, whose name's actually yours to pick. It just needs to contain and probably begin with the letter J. This, of course, is part of the final puzzle that unlocks the true ending of the game. All these characters are merely symbols, symptoms more like, for a decidedly American malaise.
Make me proud.
By the time they leave, I'll have the IAEA praising us as the poster boys for world peace. Out.
In each case, the perpetrators were fathers.
Only by acting out the dramaturgy of a good father, one who notices his family's existence and cares for them with love and attention, only then can the player escape the house arrest of PT and see, however faintly, that glimpse of all that could have been in the cancelled Kojima-led horror project Silent Hills. Silent Hills was certainly real and certainly entering production when it was cancelled, but I want to introduce a new way of playing and thinking about Kojima's overnight horror legend PT, how arguably it also roughly connects the dots from Metal Gear Solid 5 Ground Zeroes to Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain, specifically in terms of the kind of horrific mind control experiments the Patriots in The Phantom Pain have inflicted on the Big Boss body double turned literal sleeper agent, Punished Venom Snake. Dissociative disorders are central to the psychological underpinnings of the Phantom Pain. This includes everything from false memories to false identities, from amnesia to time dilation. These kinds of phenomena are usually experienced only by certain kinds of trauma survivors. My premise here is that the level of traumatic torture you experience as the player character of PT could be how the Patriots induce the degree of trauma necessary to split our character's personality like an atom, to go from the medic in Ground Zeroes to, by the phantom pain, punished Venom Snake.
Now do you remember who you are? What you were meant to do?
Police arriving on scene after neighbors called 911 found the father in his car listening to the radio.
But enough with the basics, let's jump into all the relevant hints and connections that flesh out this idea between PT and phantom pain that'll put the flesh on the bones, so to speak.
Found the father in his car listening to the radio.
The rain was coming down just as hard the day we met Boss. If she's dead, we need to see the body to be sure. Boss, any clue where she might be?
Words can kill.
Several days before the murders, neighbors say they heard the father repeating a sequence of numbers in a loud voice. They said it was like he was chanting some strange spell.
I was invaded by words, burrowing and breeding inside me.
Let's go back to the solitary confinement cell. In the U.S. Army Field Manual for Human Collection and Interrogation from 2006, the most severe form of enhanced interrogation is called separation. It has its roots, as the phantom pain coyly hints with the bag over Huey Emmerich's head, in the sensory deprivation used on Gitmo's earliest guests during the War on Terror. I see PT as the first ever interactive version of the kind of, to quote the 2006 U.S. Army Field Manual, extreme anxiety, hallucinations, bizarre thoughts, depression, and antisocial behavior, end quote, that can emerge under extreme sensory deprivation. PT, I think, is doing a sort of nod to this stuff, even though ostensibly it is actually taking place in our dreams, or at least along the boundary line between dreams and wakefulness.
some alone time now and then.
This is the hypnagogic therapy that Ocelot alludes to in The Phantom Pain.
We'll have to move forward ahead of schedule. Miller already has the preparations underway. We'll have to wake up your neighbor, too.
So he's not. He seems awake now.
No. Well, he's not actively conscious yet, at least.
He was a doctor, too.
In his mind, that past no longer exists. Your past is his past now. He's going to be your phantom, not some simple diversion. He'll act as the new big boss, and the act just isn't for Cypher. He'll be your face on the world stage, until the time comes for your resurgence.
You make it sound easy.
We've been busy over the last 9 years. His altered state of consciousness has helped us implant powerful suggestions through induced hypnagogia. This is just a detour in his journey to hell. And don't forget, it's what he wanted. He's in his dog days now.
204863. 204863. 204863. 204863.
America's never been made up of just one group. But he tried to forge a single consciousness for it and from it. The idea that every citizen would use free will to unite behind their country. Unilateralism like that can't be entrusted to any one individual. So the Major sought a system that used information, words, to control the subconscious.
PT is a prison escape game, then, set in the darkest recessed chambers of the human mind, or the American mind, anyway. And it's full, I mean full, of Metal Gear Solid. Let's dive further in. To begin with, I argue PT explains the intro to The Phantom Pain, everything from the opening in the bathroom, to the extended sequence in first person, where your vision's all blurry and you're listening to the radio, to even when quiet attacks. And the giant hallucinatory whale. All these features are direct links back to PT, either in content, or at the very least in terms of how they're presented. Just like the cameo by Lisa in this photo is a link back to PT. Or much of the material in missions like Shining Lights Even in Death. Well, that's well and good for PT and MGS5, but how about MGS in PT? Well, take the reference in that last mission title I mentioned, Shining Lights Even in Death, which is a nod to Stanley Kubrick's 1981 classic The Shining. PT is obviously, even more so than Metal Gear Solid 5, indebting itself openly to this landmark horror film. Remember Danny's split personality in the movie, Tony. He likely got this split personality under a psychiatric analysis of the film, following an episode of drunken violence with his father. And that's basically what MGS5 and PT are all about. Violent and abusive fathers. Fathers who leave it to others to do what they themselves should have done. In MGS5, the real big boss abandons his organization and his former partner, exploiting them as cover for his real objectives elsewhere, sentencing them all to death as punishment for their father's sins, as a shield so he can save his own skin. In PT, a man gets fired, becomes consumed with alcoholism, and goes crazy until killing his entire family and then himself. In both games, you play as the absent father's proxy, stand-in, or doppelganger. Someone walking in the steps of a dead or absent father. PT is set, going by the decor, in the late 70s to early 80s, exactly the same time frame as PT's fake dev team name 7780s might convey, as the 9 years that Snake spends in his so-called coma. Numbers and codes, beamed all around us, are everywhere in PT as in MGS5. Radios and early hints of the coming century's digital revolution are too. Here I think of everything from the dim digital clock in the hallway, one of the first things we see in PT, to the insanity-provoking broadcasts, to the way Lisa's cries sound like they're over a radio or baby monitor, and how her approach music sounds a bit like the early sound of dial-up internet. Speaking of numbers beamed all around us, one such key number, which we see relatively a lot in the Phantom Pain, is 23, or sometimes its mirrored inversion, 53. The number sequence that seems to trigger your fake game crash in PT, when added up as integers, the number 204863, gives you guessed it, 23.
Two 204863. 204863. 204863. 204863.
I would go so far as to say that the 2353 thing from Phantom Pain comes from PT, and we can see this in the sort of mirror reflection of the digital clock when it's just about to strike midnight. The father kills his family in PT after going crazy listening to Words That Kill coming over the airwaves. In The Phantom Pain, we play as a character whose Walkman tells him what to do and who to remember being. And we fight against a villain who lectures us, warns us about the dangers of words that kill, and codes implanted in our heads sucking our minds dry, spreading through the air. And by the end of the game, that Walkman tells us to wipe out members of our own family, too. So yes, there are lots of clear commonalities here. And then there's that bathroom, which recurs in slightly different forms by my count 4 different times in the Phantom Pain, showcasing its importance to the game, symbolically. Either inside Outer Heaven or inside Punished Venom Snake's memory of the hospital in Cyprus. Oh yeah, I should point that out too. Both games play out entirely inside someone's head. since the majority of the phantom pain is actually playing out as a memory. I won't even bother to mention how the PT bathroom also visually echoes the one from Metal Gear Solid 1. Oh, I guess I just did. Next, we have the uniquely specific architecture in both PT and MGS5. Locations like the Cypress Hospital and Code Talker's Mansion in Metal Gear Solid 5, as well as, of course, the hallway in PT, all recall the 19th century, if not earlier. In all three locations, hospital, mansion, and hallway, we find vague yet striking paintings. We find prison bars redefining an otherwise innocent kind of setting for internment and police state operations. We find dramatic windows, winding maze-like oddly symmetrical corridors and floors. But more on mirrors and mirroring between PT and the phantom pain will have to wait. Let's return again, at the risk of mirroring PT's structure a little too literally, to the solitary confinement cell. The numbered days we hear so grindingly carved into the flesh of the wall, they're counting down not only since the point of first confinement, or maybe the running count of loops down the corridor are overly repetitive, lover of the familiar predecessor, the real father whose mess we in PT must clean up, or at least look to be doing so, left behind. It's also, I argue, counting days since grief first took someone beloved from our lives.
Mission info has been updated.
This is an infiltration mission. You've got to stay out of sight.
That's a major theme for Metal Gear Solid 5, as well as PT, clearly. Loss. Loss, and of course, the ghost-like or phantom-like lust for revenge. Revenge is what Lisa, the ghost in PT, is after. She doesn't seem to care whether you're the real big boss daddy or just his stand-in. Either way, she is pissed, and she wants you to notice her. One of the manifestations we experience of Lisa's rage involves losing her face. It may only be her face in a portrait, but in PT as in TPP, perception is now reality, just as metaphors have become people, and words and ideas and events from yesterday can't stop repeating like a virus coursing within the living public mind. The public mind in Ocelot's phrasing is a key concept to all this, because what I'm really suggesting is PT might be the earliest version of what by MGS4 will become the SOP, or Sons of the Patriots system, a mind control system for regulating so-called societal sanity in Metal Gear Solid 2's words. It isn't just for inflicting a new self on Venom Snake, in other words, but the prototype for the entire future someday, albeit it'll be a vastly altered and expanded form. I refer us here to the B&B Corps from Metal Gear Solid 4, who sort of guard the inner workings of the SOP system, with their leader, a mental copy of Psycho Mantis, literally pulling all the world's strings. Defeating them in battle just exposes their already severely wounded psyche to the cold light of day, and thanks to psychometric interference, like in Metal Gear Solid 1, in these sections we could vaguely perceive their senses and thoughts. Always crying babies, horrible violence, an endless hallway of blood. Always dissociation into a different self to escape the trauma. It's more or less all as PT shows us firsthand. That isolation cell, it also reminds me of the holding cells that you find POWs in Metal Gear 87. The bars on the window resemble, as I mentioned, the ones on Code Talker's Mansion, and that magic number, 204863, it's the same number of digits as the prisoner ID numbers from Ground Zeroes. Clearly in Ground Zeroes, at some point Chico, if you notice in the opening cutscene, was led to treat a new hole in his chest like the input jack for a tape player. That hints towards some serious mind games that have caused him to hallucinate. All as part of his punishment by Skullface, no doubt. That he deserves what he's getting, that idea is one way that we see, indirectly, or at least hear, Skullface used to bend Chico into defecting. That same suggestion of crime and punishment beats at the heart of the guilt-soaked PT. But what do we have to actually feel guilty for in PT? If you look closely, you have Norman Reedus' face. You can tell from looking in the mirror. You are not this man then in the picture. Regardless, just like in the Phantom Pain, the ghost without a face, Lisa, still wants revenge against you, or who and what you represent. Language and translation are, of course, key topics for the Phantom Pain. In TP, you have to translate in mirrored reverse order the word hell out from the word hello, from one scrap of wall to another, acting almost like the equivalent to messenger RNA within a cell. These aren't your words, though, that you're translating or transcribing. They aren't even your analogs, the man in the pictures. They originate from Jack the Ripper, the famous never-apprehended serial killer from the turn of the 20th century, whose namesake in Stanley Kubrick's 1963 hit Dr. Strangelove is General Jack D. Ripper, who PT also references when we hear the schizophrenic voice in the radio tell us not to trust the tap water. We of course can use the name Jack to solve the game too, since it starts with a J. Let's also not overlook the theme in PT of information control. We only hear the phrase gun control in the broadcast the second time through at the very start. There's no mention of it either with all the other possible societal causes listed for the murders. There's basically a serial killer loose, as the Jack the Ripper references make clear, but that serial killer isn't one man, it's collective, and in our American society so obsessed narcissistically with individualism, we don't know how to understand the concept of something being collective. Just look at the war on terror. The more bin Ladens we seem to kill, the more we seem to breed them. Terrorism as an enemy became collective. It's a mask or persona or disease that all the perpetrators wind up sharing by the end. If we go ahead and call the father Jack, just as there are countless Jacks, there are countless Lisas. And that's because of what they share in common, the network of shared thoughts, ideas, and practices that we call American society. Ground Zeroes tells us that ours is a society that murders the innocent. PT tells us our society is rotten to the core. Two ways of saying the same thing. Both games wind up interrogating the nature, though, not just of American society, but of its underbelly, the antisocial sort of quality that it produces, the shadow created by the light. As calling it a flare-up of the gun control issue conveys in the radio broadcast, there's a sense in both games of a continuum, of one existing not in spite of, but because of the other, as though gun violence was merely a herpes outbreak, just one of countless in the life of someone carrying the disease. Like Liquid says, it won't die as long as we still live. It's this almost biological cycle moving from life to death, light to darkness, that in these games give our world its homeostasis, its equilibrium, like the body of one great big organism. In the Phantom Pain, we're told that terrorists and mercenary groups like us are sort of like the body's parasites that are a necessary evil. Yet information control is like an autoimmune disease, the Phantom Pain also tells us, cutting off the body's ability to recognize and therefore fight off its own illnesses and pathogens, like the eye we gouge out of the picture in PT, which refers to a Bible passage saying, if your eye offends thee, then pluck it out. In both Metal Gear Solid 5 and PT, you see, we don't want to see. And so in the darkness, the parasites and insects breed. They're both in many ways two versions of one story. The gap in the door that's mentioned is a gap in the unconscious. Both warn us to the degrees of monoculturalism, America's in particular, and both, like many of Kojima's games, ultimately wind up warning you about narcissism, which is something that'll have to wait for another video. Perhaps there's no bigger clue to how PT and MGS5 connect than PT being incredibly dreamlike. Hypnagogic therapy, as Ocelot calls it, plays upon the boundary between wakefulness and sleep. That's what these eyes are doing in this section, rapid eye movement, as during sleep. MGS5 as a whole, for this reason, also has qualities of a dream. Like in PT, we never really seem to fully wake up or come to. I could go on, but I'll end with the spider in the hallway, which is my favorite sort of possible clue here. Gradually, the spider gains a shadow, once you get the flashlight, that is. And then you find that shadow drawing closer and closer until, from some angles, the two become indistinguishable. Isn't that, in a nutshell, what happens to transform psychologically the medic from Ground Zeroes into Punished Venom Snake from the Phantom Pain? Couldn't the spider sort of be a unconscious stand-in for a snake? Well, we may never know these answers for sure, but here's to 10 more years of being still in a dream, Snake. Until next time.